Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. And first, congratulations to Policy Circle for launching and doing an in-person event, which gives us a chance to meet everyone, familiar faces once again. And I am always eager to encourage more organizations that are engaging with improving public policy. So here I am from Bangalore and hoping to add a little light to this debate. As Athar has pointed out, when that particular bill came up, the basic reason why I spoke in the way I did was because I've actually been a student of risk regulation. If I don't do any of that right now, but in 2014, just at the same time as I was elected to Parliament, I had edited a book with Oxford University Press called India's Risks, which focused on health, environment, safety, climate change, an array of essays on that particular topic. So I was actually approaching it as much from a scholarly perspective and with some understanding of how things had changed and how things should change around the world. But the interesting spin-off was that suddenly there were memes on the internet with with my photo saying only one fellow one MP understands the topic, and I became some hero to the vaping community, which I've never vaped. I probably will never do so. But it turned out to be an interesting spin-off of that particular exercise. In any case, Dr. Sharma and Mr. Prabhu have already spoken and given you a little bit of a background, and so let me delve deeper into some of the complexities of this domain. One of the fundamental challenges is the nature of cause and effect in the tobacco consumption domain, which is that you may have a cigarette today and you may have a cigarette tomorrow, and the actual impact may be felt 30 years later, that too with possible continuous exposure over time. Now, you might say, 30 years seems like a long time for someone to do that. And I must say here that I'm here speaking as an occasional smoker myself, but my first cigarette was at the age of 15, the day my high school exam finished, for the same reason that Mr. Prabhu mentioned, which was that, we're now adults, let us celebrate by doing something like this. And in those days, I'm talking about the 70s and 80s, I'm from a different era, and the same aspect about advertising, right? There was, I think from your hometown, one new brand came called Charms, right? And Charms was packaged in a blue jeans kind of a packet, and their advertisements featured very, very modern themes. Okay, the slogan, one of the slogans was a guy and a couple on a motorcycle, and it basically, I still remember this, right? So it was, give me the highway, give me my girl, and give me the taste of toasted tobacco. Okay? Now, for a young man who's 16, 17 years old, this, bike, girlfriend, whatever, these are all aspirations. And toasted tobacco, packaged in a very nice blue jeans, packet, ended up, causing many people to say, let's check this out, right? And the interesting thing is that once you check it out, right, the real challenge is to prevent people from having their first cigarette. Okay, and I try to do that with my children, and as far as I know, they have not. You cannot tell. My children are adults, but I don't think they are consumers. But growing up, I told them, don't ever have your first cigarette, right? And of course, I added, I've never smoked, which is a white lie, as we would say. And then my kids told me, Dad, it's okay, we know. Because in 2004, if you ever search for this article on Rediff, there's an article which is called Sonia's New Whiz Kid. It's about me, written by a journalist who visited me when I was a union president or vice president in St. Joseph's College. And it starts, the first line is, she's remembering her first meeting with me, and it starts, smoke was spiraling out of her cigarette in his hand. It starts like that about me. So there you go. You can't hide these from the next generation. But still, the fact that we have to prevent people from, taking the first step is is a reason for a tremendous amount of effort in publicizing in a way that appeals to youth through modern and social media and all kinds of other channels to ensure that you prevent people from having the first cigarette. But that is likely, I mean, so this is an issue that came up during that debate as well. Dr. Harshvardhan, who piloted the bill at that time, brought up the argument that they had raided a school, okay, and found a lot of these ENDS devices in children's bags. So I said, I don't know why you're raiding schools, and this doesn't seem the right thing to do to begin with. But I pointed out that youngsters are going to experiment. If it is not this, they will go to cigarettes. They will try something else, okay? So I'm not sure that you can change that, experimentation, orientation of youngsters, but you can still find a way to communicate to them that this is not something to pursue. And then they may experiment with worse things. So it's always a trade-off. So when I talk about trade-offs, that's one of the central features about this larger regulatory domain. On the one hand, you have farmers who are growing tobacco. You have very poor people who roll bidis for a living, and so there are livelihoods involved. And not to forget ITC and its employees and shareholders and others as well. But the basic point is, there is also the government's addiction to revenues that come from excise duties on tobacco and alcohol. These are harmful products beyond a point. And but the way the governments have regulate these is to say, okay, we'll try and increase the price to some extent and hope that people will, you'll get a response, a sort of a supply-demand response. But as Dr. Sharma pointed out, the response to higher taxes and higher prices is, fades out over time. Okay, things might slow down a bit, and but essentially there is a response, and globally it has actually proven to be something worthwhile. But there again, why these particular instruments, economic instruments, don't have that much of an impact is because of the other dimension of tobacco, which is people get addicted to nicotine. And they want that stimulation from nicotine. And once that happens, then people will pay higher prices if it comes to that. At least in India, compared to the rest of the world, this is my personal experience, these are odd features, but for example, I've never bought a lighter, okay, because I'm still in denial that I am an occasional smoker. I still live with batches of bumming a light from somebody when I do smoke. But the best part is, in India, since we allow loose sale of cigarettes, anyone who wants an occasional cigarette can still get it. While if you buy a packet, which is what the Western practice is, you will actually smoke the entire packet. It's there with you, and you will start first thing in the morning until last thing at night, you will end up smoking more. So those sort of subtle features about where, people say you should ban loose sale. But frankly, I actually think that's an example of something that can actually lower the overall burden. Anyways, so my drivers are always wondering, why does the boss send for two rather than a packet, Because every few days sometimes it'll be like, okay, especially when there's ticket-seeking time or some other highly tense, which we've just finished, by the way, period. These are the times when you want some external help or a crutch of some kind. Nonetheless, right? So we are talking about tobacco being consumed in different forms. In cigarettes, which is the refined form, and now with filters and things like that, but also bidis, also chewing tobacco. These are, the health impacts are tremendous. And unfortunately, the health impacts have not been well understood because the victims, discover, as I said, much, much later in life. And so what tends to happen is that there's another feature associated with this. For the longest time, tobacco regulation had the notion of regulating tobacco very intrusively was not taken up because it was seen as a voluntary risk. Okay, it is something that you choose to do by yourself. right? And but as it turns out, and in those days, that's why you had all that very seductive advertising. But you also had smoking in public spaces at home. It was never seen as something to be disapproved of. Okay, but and for the longest time, at least in the West, the tobacco industry ensured that the direct connection between tobacco smoking and cancer, emphysema, and other lung diseases was never easily proved. Okay, that was still always a leap of faith. That changed over time, but the biggest change in attitudes came from the recognition of the impact of second-hand smoke. So it was no longer just a person voluntarily subjecting himself or herself to this particular risk, but you're actually subjecting your neighbor, your family members, and everyone else. And then societal attitudes started to change. And so you started to see people saying, boss, smoke outside or far away. Otherwise, growing up, I've been on planes where you could smoke. Right? I mean, a fairly closed environment, but you could still smoke, and they would hand out cigarettes on planes in the 1970s, on international flights and things like that. And if you're in some old aircraft, you might still find a little ashtray in your seat handle, actually. Anyways, the point being that all that changed. And then people started to then the other thing was voluntary as well as involuntary regulations, meaning imposed regulations on separation of smoking and non-smoking areas, and eventually moving smoking to outside areas rather than inside. So all these sorts of things happened. And for me, I think the biggest indicator of, what shall we say, of societal attitude change was when I was in the US, I started to see in the dating columns, they would say, only a non-smoker should respond. The moment that happens, I don't know what it's like with the Tinder generation, but at least in those days, once you see that this is the, only non-smokers should respond, then you see that something's changed. People are very, very clear. And that's how regulations evolved here as well. You had bans on advertising, bans on sponsorship. There is still surrogate advertising of some kinds, but but it's not that effective anymore. Just like you have with liquor, Kingfisher, soda water, something like that. It's all there is always surrogate ways of doing things, but nonetheless, the statutory warning, as Mr. Prabhu said, didn't really make much of a difference. Okay, in fact, the language was so heavy. Okay, cigarette smoking, may be injurious to health or something like that. Now it's much more direct, right? There is, a huge, graphic, ugly picture covering the brand of the cigarette itself, and it says smoking will kill you, or smoking kills, something of that sort. So those are very, very graphic ways, but again, it's not clear that the effect is very significant because people get used to it, and in any case, the addiction, the need for nicotine overrides the concern about a possible horrible future. Anyway, that's one side. The other, of course, the other massively impactful regulation that came out in India, to my mind, is actually one that I did not think would be effective, because it's not one that can be easily policed. And this is Anbumani Ramdas's ban on smoking in public places, right? And who's there to enforce this? Right? How many people can you catch and punish and things like that? But societally, overall, it seems to have been accepted. And as a result, you don't find that many people, everyone seems to be following this practice of going out, not subjecting somebody else to this, not insisting on smoking in private places. I'm not even sure exactly what all is allowed and what is not, but nonetheless, it's in my anecdotal understanding, it seems to have actually worked and brought the whole consumption down. Now, the other side of all this is, if people do want to reduce their consumption, how do you help them? How do you give them a nicotine fix in a manner that is possibly less harmful? Harm reduction, as Dr. Sharma pointed out, right? And so this is where I had a dispute with Dr. Harshvardhan and the government for coming up with the particular approach that they chose with electronic nicotine delivery service systems or ends or whatever they call it. So basically, obviously the science of these new technologies, it will not be fully understood because we don't know. There are some studies from UK which show that it is massively less harmful than smoking tobacco. Because when you smoke, you're inhaling all kinds of other products. The burnt paper, carbon monoxide, various other things. When all you're after is a nicotine fix, right? So, like you mentioned, nicotine patches have been used for quite a while to wean people off direct consumption through smoking. And so the same approach is what I thought is the philosophy behind these newer technologies, which is give a chance to get the nicotine fix without possibly the same level of harms. Maybe much reduced. There may still be some harms, and we don't know. Because even these devices use different kinds of, some other kinds of material to get that to you, right? I've forgotten the technical language for that. But nonetheless, the basic thing is you are using some organic chemicals to make the smoke sensation happen and things of that sort. And we don't know what impact on your health would arise from consumption of that. So, but nonetheless, on the face of it, on the basis of the US studies or UK studies, it seemed to me fairly clear that the evidence suggested that these new technologies should not be banned, but should actually be allowed if it will allow people to shift from the more harmful methods of ingesting nicotine to a less harmful. But the minister and the health secretary at that time were very, very insistent that a ban was imperative and urgent because Juul, I think, was about to enter the Indian market. And they said, we want to prevent this from entering before it does. Mrs. Preeti Sudan wrote an article in an op-ed piece. Can I just have some water, please? Yeah. Thank you. Where she said that she had seen youngsters using these devices, and she was very upset about it in a park or something like that. That's hardly the basis for such a stringent regulation. And so my proposal there was, okay, don't ban. Ban will lead to underground activities, which it has, all right? And because those who consume are able to still source materials, but it may not be as pure as you can't go sue somebody underground for in a consumer court, for example. No, I'm fine. Yeah. The basic point is that, my solution was, just like nicotine patches or other solutions which are offered to people through a prescription. Why don't you allow that? This way, children just can't go get hold of them. People who want to cease their addiction to tobacco could move towards an alternative and things like that. But the minister was unmoved. And, of course, we are opposition MPs. And I have had a chance I have had the opportunity once on the surrogacy regulation bill where the government actually listened to me, and even though a bill had been passed in the Lok Sabha, they actually set up a select committee and changed the law after some of our criticism. So, occasionally opposition members do have some impact, but certainly not in this context. But I'm continuing to write about this. I'm working on a policy paper on this subject, and I'm speaking about this because I do think that it's never too late to reconsider, and it's possibly the right thing to do to move away from tobacco consumption through the regular platforms to maybe less harmful alternatives. The could be very significant. The health costs, direct and indirect, are tremendous. The economic costs on people and their families are also tremendous. And so it's imperative that tobacco regulation evolves to reduce harm, to provide people with enough information, and scales up efforts like cessation clinics, etc., that will help people literally wean themselves off these addictions. But for that, you need alternative methods, including ends, which will allow people to sort of phase out over time. And that's the real submission that I have here today. And I hope that we will move towards a future which is much more rational, which allows people to voluntarily find ways out of their now involuntary addiction to, to the product that they should have stayed away from in the first place. Thank you so much.